In this video, I am going to show you how to make increases and decreases. And when you increase in knitting, you are adding stitches to your work on your needles. And when you decrease, you're taking stitches away and so you have fewer stitches. And there are many, many ways of doing both of these things. I'm just going to cover a couple of the most commonly called for techniques, but there are tons of videos on YouTube explaining all kinds of other ways of doing increases and decreases. Before we do that, I want to say a little bit about stitch mount or stitch orientation, which is actually important in doing decreases and increases. So you might have noticed, or maybe you haven't, that in knitting, stitches are oriented on the needle in a particular way. In that first workshop, I pointed out how knit stitches are basically V's, right? These little, it's a column of V's. We talk about the leg, the two legs of a knit stitch, with this being the right leg and this being the left leg of this particular stitch. Right, so we have a stitch here. So this is the right leg and this is the left leg. And what you will notice is that in knitting, stitches sit on your needle in the same way. That is, the working yarn comes up from the previous stitch in the row below. The right leg comes up over the needle. The left leg is behind, and then it enters that same lower stitch again, right? So you can see here's the current stitch, here's the previous stitch, and the yarn comes out of that stitch and then goes back into that stitch and then goes over into the next stitch, and the same thing happens. It goes up over the front and then down behind and into the next stitch. And so you always are, in knitting, it's always the right leg of the stitch that is leading and that is in the front of the needle, and the left leg that is behind. So when you knit, you do like so, right? You go in on the left side of the stitch, you wrap the yarn around, and you pull your needle out. You enter from the left, wrap the yarn, and pull the needle out. If you go in from the right side, that is, you're kind of entering into the middle of the stitch, that's called knitting through the back loop, and it twists the stitch. It's kind of hard to see because I'm working on such large needles, but if you look at this stitch, the left leg is actually crossed over the right leg. Hopefully you can see that, right? Here's the left leg, and it's actually crossing over the right leg. I'll do it again. So I'm knitting into the back of the stitch, or knitting through the back loop, rather than the way you conventionally knit. And it actually causes the stitch to twist. And this is a technique. There are patterns that will call for you to knit through the back of the stitch to create this twisted knit stitch. But in general, you're always entering from the left, and that right leg is in the front and the left leg is in the back. You will also, on occasion, find that as you're knitting, you discover that a stitch is backwards. This often happens if you have to rip back some rows because you made a mistake or there's something you don't like that you want to do over again, and then you put the needles, like if you rip back, right, you end up with these separate little loops that are just kind of hanging there, and you just put the needle back through them. But often it's actually easier to come from the other side like that, and then you end up with a stitch that's backwards. And so when you're knitting, if you find that, I'm going to just put a backward stitch on here. You can usually pick that up pretty quickly because it's harder to get your needle into the stitch because the stitch is backwards. And you don't have to fuss with like turning the stitch around. If you knit into the back of the stitch, it will actually flip around of its own accord, right? Because knitting into the back of the stitch twists the stitch. So basically you're untwisting it if you do that when you have a backward stitch on your needles. Now this is important because it actually plays a role in how you approach doing increases and decreases. So I just wanted to start with that. I'm going to put these, I'm just going to slip all of these back that I have already knitted. I'm entering these stitches from the wrong side so that they'll be mounted correctly. So I'm going to start with increases, and I'm going to start with what I think is probably the most straightforward and easiest increase, which is called the lifted increase. In general, you don't see the lifted increase being called for in patterns very often, and it's a relatively new way of increasing. It's kind of incredible that a craft that has been around for as long as knitting has, still people discover new ways of doing things. But I do like the lifted increase. It's really easy to perform. So I'm going to start with that one. And I'm just going to knit 2 stitches so that we're doing the increase a little bit further in from the edge. So for the lifted increase, you're just going to come to the stitch where you need the place in the pattern where you need to increase by a stitch. And you're going to pick up the right leg of the stitch immediately below the next stitch that you're going to knit. You're going to go down and pick up that leg, put it on the needle, and knit it as if it's an actual stitch. And then you just go ahead and knit the rest of those stitches. And that has actually increased your knitting by 1 stitch. And it's not very prominent. You don't really see it very easily in the finished product, which is what people like about lifted increases. And there's another version of the lifted increase that I will show you when I get to the other side of this little swatch. And that is a little bit different, and I'll tell you why you would do one and why you would do the other. So again, I'm going to stop with 2 stitches left so that I have some plain edge stitches. And now I'm going to do a different version of that lifted increase. So this time, because I've knit, so normally I would pick up this stitch, right? But I'm going to be working under this stitch, which means that if I had done this before I worked this stitch, I would be going into this stitch. And that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to pick up the left leg this time. And I'm going to put that on the left-hand needle. And now you'll notice that this stitch is mounted incorrectly, right? The right leg is behind and the left leg is in front. So I'm going to knit into the back of the stitch. Whoop. Just like that. And then knit 1 and knit another one. Now, the reason there are 2 different versions of the lifted increase and 2 different versions of most increases is that increases and decreases tend to lean in one direction or another. And so there are right-leaning decreases that sort of go off in that direction and left-leaning decreases that go off in that direction. And so if you're knitting increases and your fabric is widening, you want those increases to kind of line up cleanly so that they look kind of parallel, they run parallel to the edge of your knitting. And so the increase where you pick up the stitch below is a right-leaning increase. And the increase where you pick up the 3rd stitch, not the stitch immediately below, but rather the 2nd stitch below, the 3rd stitch down, that's a left-leaning increase. So that's the reason for the differences. I'm going to purl back quickly, and I'll chop that out of the video because it's not very interesting to watch somebody purl. And then I'll come back and do those lifted increases one more time so you can see them. Okay, I'm back. So I'm going to do those lifted increases one more time so you can see them. So I'm just going to knit 2 rows, 2 stitches. Get that further up the needle. So again, I'm going to do the right leaning increase. That means I'm going to lift the leg, the right leg of the next stitch, right like that. Just place it on that left-hand needle. I'm going to knit that. And then I'm going to just knit the rest of the stitches across. And I'll do this until I get to the final 2 stitches on the other side. These needles are very big. They're much larger needles than I would normally use with yarn of this weight, but it's good because the stitches are big and it's easier to see what you're doing, or it's easier for you to see what I'm doing. So now I've got 2 stitches left for my little edging. I'm going to do the increase now, the left leaning lifted increase. So I'm going to go down and pick up the stitch 2 stitches below this stitch on my needle, and because it's now, and I'm going to lift it onto the left-hand needle, and because it's backwards, I'm actually going to knit into the back of the stitch. Whoop, I got to hold on to it, just like that. And then I'm going to knit those final 2 stitches. And that is the lifted increase. And I'm showing you all of these increases and decreases in pairs, one right leaning, one left leaning, but in many patterns, you're just like increasing or decreasing across a row of stitches. Like every 4th stitch, you have to insert an increase. And it really doesn't matter which of these increases you use in a situation like that. These paired left leaning and right leaning increases are for situations where you really want that symmetry on both sides. Like you're increasing only on the edges and you're using them to define a really specific shape. Otherwise, if it just says increase, you know, every 4th stitch, you can use whatever increase method works best for you. Okay, I'm now going to show you a different increase method, the one that is much more common, called for in patterns more often, but it's more fiddly than the lifted increase. So I think I wanted to give you both of those. I'm going to stop again. I'm going to purl back, and so I will just edit the purling out of the video so you don't have to watch me purl because it's really not very exciting. Okay, I have finished purling, and I am now going to show you the other and much more common approach to increasing stitches, and those are the make one increases, make one right and make one left. So again, these are a little bit more fiddly than the one that I just showed you where you're just doing the lifted increase, where you're just lifting a stitch from the row below or from a row below and knitting into that. But this one is much more common. You see this much more often in knitting instructions. So I'm going to again knit 2 stitches, and now what you really need to focus on for the make one increases, is this length of yarn that runs between stitches, right? So it's kind of the connecting stretch of yarn between this stitch and then this stitch, which I've already worked. To make the right leaning increase, you pick up that length of yarn coming in from the back of your work, just like that, and then you knit it. Boom, just like that. And now I'm going to go across, and I will show you how to do the left-leaning version of that, which is pretty much the same, but it's slightly different. I'm going to stop when I have 2 stitches again. And I'm going to do the same thing, only for the left leaning decrease, I'm going to come in through the front. And now I have to actually knit into the back of this stitch so that I can twist that, because if I didn't, I can show you what would happen. If I knit this just like this, I end up with this great big hole. So I have to twist this piece that I've picked up, and that means knitting into the back of the stitch. And that will put a twist into it, which will tighten up the stitch. And then across. Okay, so I'm going to, again, purl across, and I'll stop the video and then restart it when I get to the other side. And I will do those 2 increases again so that you can really see what they look like. Okay, I'm back. So I'm going to just do those same 2 decreases again so that you can see them. They're a little bit weirder than the lifted increases. So again, for the right leaning increase, you find that length of the yarn that runs between the stitches. You pick it up from the back. You knit it like an ordinary stitch. And now you have an extra stitch, and now you're going to just go across like this until you have 2 stitches left on the other end. One, 2. And now you're going to do that same thing again, only this time you're going to pick up that length of yarn on the left-hand needle coming from the front of your work. And that means you're going to have to knit into the back of the stitch, not the way you typically knit. And then you can go across the rest of the stitches. And you can see, looking at it, how the work here is starting to flare out because of the extra stitches. But you can also see how the stitches kind of follow that curve because they are either leaning to the left or leaning to the right. I'm going to knit a couple of plain rows and then come back and start and show you the common decrease methods. Okay, I'm back. I've knit a couple of extra rows so that we have some plain rows without any increases or decreases in them. And now we're going to look at the most common decrease method. Again, there's a right leaning and a left leaning. They kind of mirror each other. And these are by far the most common decrease methods. There are other ways to decrease, but these are the ones that are called for the most often and will almost always, as long as you're only decreasing by 1 stitch, these are the decreases you'll most likely use. So you'll notice that I put some little removable stitch markers into a couple of stitches, and I did that for a purpose. It will help illustrate what determines which way a decrease is going to lean. So now, because we're decreasing, our knitting is going to get narrower. So we did right leaning increases, but now we're going to do left leaning decreases. So the first decrease that I'm going to do is something called slip, slip, knit together. So I'm going to knit my first 2 stitches again, just to have that edging. And now I'm going to slip the next 2 stitches. I'm going to put my right hand needle in as if I'm going to knit them, but I'm just going to slide them over to that right hand needle. And now I'm going to take the left hand needle and put that back into those 2 stitches. And what you'll see now is I'm actually going to knit these 2 stitches together through the back loop. So I'm going to take my yarn, wrap it around, pull it out, and what you see is that stitch is the stitch that is lying on top, and it's what determines that there's this sort of left-leaning characteristic to that particular decrease. And now we'll see on the other side, we're going to do a different decrease on the other side that will result in a right-leaning decrease. So again, I'll bore you by just knitting across really quickly, or as quickly as I can. I'm using needles that are kind of big for this particular yarn, but I think these larger stitches are easier to see. So I'm going to stop when I have 2 stitches left before my little edging. So 1 more. And now this will be the right leaning decrease. So I'm going to, for the right leaning decrease, I'm going to take my right hand needle and I'm just going to insert it into these 2 stitches as if I'm going to knit each one of them, and I'm going to knit them together. And this is called knit 2 together. And I'm going to pull that out, and you can see, and then knit the next 2. And you can see how that stitch is kind of, that decrease is kind of left leaning, or right leaning, I should say. So it's sort of going off in that direction, that direction. So one thing to be aware of is that whichever stitch is on top, right? A decrease, you're basically putting 2 stitches, one on top of the other. Whichever stitch is on top is what's going to determine its lean. If it's the second stitch of the 2 stitches that's on top, it's going to lean to the right. If it's the first stitch of those 2 stitches, it's going to lean to the left. I'm going to purl across again, and I'll see you when I get to the other side, and then I'll do those 2 decreases one more time. Okay, I'm back again, and I've moved my stitch markers so that you can see what I'm doing. And I'm going to do those 2 decreases one more time, and I'm going to sort of walk you through it again. So I'm just going to knit 2 stitches at the edge here so that my decreases are happening a little bit further into my knitted fabric. And now I'm going to do the slip, slip, knit. And you'll notice the first stitch that my right hand needle goes into is this one with the stitch marker in it, and then the second stitch. And so that's going to be the stitch that is on top after I knit these 2 stitches together through the back loop. Right? It's the one that's got the marker in it. That one is on top, the second stitch is on the bottom, and they are leaning off to the left. Right? Can you see that, I hope? And now I'm going to go across and do the other one. You can see how that one works. That's this knit 2 together. That one is much more straightforward, I think. Yay. There we go. So one more. Okay, so this one, and you'll see again, in knit two together, I'm entering that second stitch first, and then entering the first stitch, wrapping the yarn, pulling it through and off. And now it's the second stitch that was on top, or that ends up being on top when I knit two stitches together, and that gives me that right lean rather than the left lean. So those are decreases. That's how you do them, and you can see how again the fabric is kind of bending in this way, and how the stitches are kind of running parallel to that bend because I'm using those the appropriate decreases to lean in the right direction. So that's it. Practice those decreases, and I hope to see you all next Thursday.